The African River. Previously on, the crossing of the Mediterranean brought Alexander and Helena face to face with a brutal storm that tested courage and love with that particular savagery of the sea, which cares nothing for intentions, only for capabilities. After the waters relented, they docked in Hispania, where Helena's simple gesture of preparing soup turned strangers into brothers, and where Alexander relived the memory of the afternoon she taught him to strike fire from the Thule stone, that spark that lit not just straw, but destiny. With provisions renewed and unexpected allies gained, the Alethea raised her sails once more, now toward what the ancient charts called the edge of the world, the Pillars of Hercules. And beyond them, the ocean no sensible Greek would dare to sail without a reason large enough to justify the madness of trying. In this new episode, we will discover together how, after crossing the Pillars of Hercules, that boundary the ancients erected not merely in stone, but in belief, in the collective conviction that beyond it the world simply ended, the Alethea will detect something no map has ever recorded: a scent. The earthy fragrance of a river pouring itself into the sea, fresh water meeting salt water at a delta that seems to connect two worlds that were never meant to find each other. What begins as a strategic stop for resupply will reveal that the African River is not merely a resource, it is a test. The Carthaginians who guard those waters with the authority of men who serve an empire that tolerates no foreign boldness will confront Alexander with a decree that sounds like a sentence. But destiny had reserved for that moment a turn no sword could ever have produced. Helena simply stepped forward, without a word, without a weapon. Presence alone. And what that presence awakened in those men who had never witnessed anything like her will reveal that the forces which truly move the world are rarely the ones warriors are able to see. The Pillars and beyond. The beaches of Hispania were nothing more than a line of sand dissolving into the horizon, a farewell offered by the land itself with that quiet grace of places that know you must leave before they can need you back. The Alethea pressed forward, carried by winds that blew with that particular quality of favorable omens, not the arrogant force that pushes because it can, but the gentle direction that points because it knows where the ship ought to go. There was on the deck a feeling of rebirth that was not euphoria, but that specific lightness that comes after danger real enough has been crossed. Every filled sail was a lung-breathing destiny. Every oar dipping into the sea was a heartbeat, keeping alive the promise of new discoveries. Alexander, steady at the helm, carried in his eyes the memory of all those who had dared before him to cut through the waves toward the unknown, not as a burden, but as fuel, the silent inheritance of sailors who built routes as one writes verses into the skin of the ocean. And at his side, Helena watched the waters with the attention of someone reading signs that do not lie on the surface, that exist in the quality of movement, in the direction of certain waves, in the way light falls upon one point of the sea and not another. And to you who follow this crossing, who step with us into this territory where African rivers guard secrets that entire empires could not protect, I leave a simple but essential request. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your comments sharing what you feel. Every gesture of yours is a flame that joins the others, strengthening the invisible current that unites hearts across time and the mysteries that await revelation. In doing so, you are not merely supporting this work, you become part of this tapestry. The story continues, and it is your presence that keeps the fire alive. With the wind in their favor and their hearts prepared, the Alethea drew close to the legendary Pillars of Hercules with that slowness of arrivals known to be irreversible. Two stone giants rose like guardians of an ancestral secret, not guardians who protect through force, but through meaning, through the collective belief of generations of men who had decided that those columns were the last word the human world could speak before the silence of the unknown took hold. To many of the crew, they were the edge of the known world. To Helena, they were bridges, because she had learned from girlhood, listening to Tiphys recount lights dancing in the sky of an island north of any map, that the limits men erect in stone exist for those who accept them as final, but become portals for those who recognize them as provisional. The crew, hardened though they were by salt and wind, held their silence as the Alethea positioned herself for the crossing, as though passing through that portal were not merely a nautical act, but an act of devotion, a declaration that they belonged to the category of people who do not accept that the world ends where the map ends. The silence was broken by the deep sound of water beating against the rocks, with that quality of drums announcing a ceremony. Not the ceremony of men, which requires a priest and ritual and the right words, but the ceremony of the universe, which uses stone and water and wind as instruments of something that has no adequate name in any human tongue. When the Alethea passed between the pillars, the sailors drew deep breaths as though plunging into a new world. Some murmured prayers, others thought of their loved ones, and one or two swore they had seen shapes dancing upon the waves, shadows of gods or ghosts of navigators who had never returned. Leaving the pillars behind, an expanse of calmer waters revealed itself as though the sea had accepted the audacity of those souls. The sky broader, the wind more generous, the sun descending in golden reflections that bathed the hull in that specific light of things that have been approved. And between Alexander and Helena, in the silence that needed no words, a mutual understanding that they had crossed not merely a geographical boundary, but an existential threshold, and that the world ahead promised no certainties, only possibilities that exist solely for those who have come far enough to deserve them. The Delta and the Omen. There are moments when the world changes its scent before it changes its appearance. Alexander noticed it first with his nose, before his eyes could confirm what his sense of smell had already registered as something that exceeded the category of sea. The vastness of the ocean began to transform with that gradualness of transformations that do not announce their arrival, that are simply already happening by the time one realizes they are happening. The salt smell of the waves began blending with an unfamiliar breath of freshness, an earthy fragrance drifting in from the south with that quality of aromas that belong to entirely different categories than what the sea produces. The smell of river, of riverbank, of vegetation that grew near fresh water, of earth that had been wetted in a way different from how the sea wets things. Alexander, with attentive eyes that had learned to read the horizon as a text demanding interpretation and not mere observation, was the first to spot the change. A sinuous line where the salt waters of the ocean met the force of a river, throwing itself into the sea like a pulsing vein of a continent that the Greeks knew only through the stories of merchants who had returned from there bearing goods and descriptions that most preferred to dismiss as exaggeration. The sailors rose to their feet, curious, watching that meeting of waters with the particular fascination of people who discover in the world something that was not in the manual they had been using to navigate it. The current of fresh water poured forth with such power that it altered even the color of the sea, dark waves and pale ones intertwining like two elements that, rather than warring for supremacy, recognized themselves as part of the same greater cycle and decided, at that specific point, to demonstrate what happens when opposites meet with the intention of completing rather than canceling each other. Alexander knew that this place would be an opportunity to resupply the crew after so many days on the open sea. But he also sensed, with that intuition of the navigator, who had learned that the most important opportunities are rarely only what they appear to be, that every meeting of forces so different carried hidden mysteries that would only reveal themselves to one willing to offer something more than simply taking what the place provided and moving on. Helena, leaning against the bow railing, observed the natural spectacle with eyes that reflected both wonder and foreboding. That particular combination belonging to one who perceives beauty and at the same time perceives that the beauty is communicating something beyond itself. There was something in that river that spoke to her in silence, as though memories buried in Nordic origins she carried without having fully lived them, whispered through the current with that insistence of inheritances that choose their own moments to surface. To the crew, Helena was not merely a lady aboard. She was almost a priestess, capable of deciphering signs where others saw only landscape, of perceiving what the river was saying before anyone around her had yet arrived at the conclusion that the river was saying anything at all. Alexander ordered the longboats lowered into the water. The surroundings seemed welcoming, as though the forces inhabiting that place had decided that these particular travelers deserved a hospitality not available to everyone. But amid the joy of solid ground in sight and fresh water within reach, there also hung a silence of expectation. Not the silence that is simply the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had not yet revealed its form. The confrontation on the banks. The Carthaginians were not enemies, they were guardians. And between those two categories lay a difference Alexander would need to understand quickly, because guardians who feel disrespected become enemies with a speed that declared enemies rarely match. As they drew near the riverbanks with the longboats loaded with empty amphorae and nets ready to cast, the sailors caught sight of human figures who were not there by chance. Sturdy men, bronze-skinned and simply dressed, working nets with a skill that came from generations of knowledge of those specific waters. The symbols on their tunics betrayed their origin, Carthaginians, subjects of an empire that dominated the commerce and naval power of the Western Mediterranean, with that particular combination of economic efficiency and willingness to use force that made Carthage simultaneously the best partner and the worst enemy a foreign navigator could encounter. They were not there by chance, but in service, fishing for their emperor, offering him the finest those waters could yield, and doing so under the authority of laws that transformed the simplicity of fishing into a matter of imperial sovereignty. Alexander narrowed his gaze with that particular expression of those who recognize a problem before the problem declares its presence. He knew of Carthage's rigid laws through the accounts of merchants who had learned those laws in the most costly way possible. Foreigners were forbidden from fishing in waters under the empire's watch, under penalty of severe punishments that varied according to the local guard's temper and the disposition of the day. There, in that instant, the freshness of the river that had promised rest and sustenance transformed into tension with that swiftness of transformations that require only a single new piece of information to completely reorganize the meaning of everything that had previously been available as simple possibility. The air was no longer merely the breath of land. It was the weight of a confrontation about to be born between necessity on one side and law on the other. Two forces that rarely meet without someone paying the price of the difference between them. The silence of the bank was cut by the rhythmic sound of the Greek longboat's oars drawing closer. The Carthaginians lifted their eyes from their nets and fixed their gaze on the newcomers with a distrust that was at once professional and personal. The distrust of those assigned to do something and who know that doing it well means leaving no room for interpretations favorable to the other side. One of them, bearing himself with an upright bearing and a face hardened by years of African sun, raised his voice. His words, carrying the sonority of the Carthaginian tongue, were translated by gestures that needed no translation. Foreign men were not permitted to fish here. His intonation was like a sentence, firm and final, as though it were the river itself decreeing its limits through the voice of a man who had been authorized to speak on behalf of the empire. Alexander, still silent, weighed each option with that swiftness of thought that distinguishes good commanders from those who need time to decide. Retreat and accept the hunger of days ahead, or challenge the decree and risk Carthaginian steel on foreign soil far from any ally who might intervene. The bank seemed narrower, the air heavier, and then Helena stepped forward. The unexpected captain. It was not a conscious decision. It was the movement of someone who sensed that her moment had come before any conscious reasoning could mediate the recognition. Like when someone sees a person falling and extends their arm before having thought to extend it. Helena moved forward in the longboat with that quality of movement that is not imposition, but undeniable. Like water rising, like light occupying space without announcing that it is doing so. Her gray eyes, deep and serene with that serenity that is not the absence of awareness of danger, but the presence of something that exceeds it, met those of the Carthaginians. The wind played with her silver blonde hair, lit by the golden light of late afternoon, with that quality of light that transforms the ordinary into an apparition. And something happened that Alexander had noticed before only in other circumstances, never with this clarity. Helena's presence needed no words. It was direct communication, the transmission of something that operated below the level at which the laws of Carthage functioned, below the level at which a guard's decree held authority, in a more ancient, more fundamental layer, where certain recognitions occur before any system of rules has time to intervene. The sun-hardened Carthaginians, who had maintained the rigidity of fortress walls before Alexander and his sailors, began to waver with that particular wavering of those who encounter something that exceeds the categories they possess for classifying what they are encountering. The gazes that had previously examined intruders to be repelled became gazes that examined a presence to be understood. And the difference between those two qualities of looking was visible to anyone attentive enough to notice that what had been on the Carthaginian faces had changed without a single word being spoken. To those men, Helena was not an intruder defying the law of Carthage. She was something the law of Carthage had not anticipated because it had not been written to contend with her. A woman who carried within herself a symbolism that even those rigid guardians recognized at a level that exceeded any instruction they had ever received. Fertility, abundance, continuity, values that not even empires dared to deny when they presented themselves with sufficient clarity to be perceived. Alexander sensed the shift in the air with that attention of the navigator who reads atmospheric changes before they become weather conditions. His blue eyes, accustomed to forecasting storms, noticed that the rigidity was dissolving, but alongside that relief came also the weight of a paradox that few men of his era would have had the humility to acknowledge without resistance. He, heir to navigators, stood before a moment in which his strength simply had no voice. It was Helena who, without raising a sword or forming an argument, was turning the tide of destiny. Not through imposition, but through presence, through a power born of her mere existence, operating according to laws that no military strategy treatise or commercial diplomacy manual had ever recorded, because they belonged to a category of forces that civilizations frequently forget, and that the world frequently remembers through women who carry them within themselves without ever having been taught to do so. The Carthaginians, convinced that she was the captain of the Alethea, not because anyone had declared it, but because her presence made that interpretation the only one that made sense given what they were witnessing, indicated with gestures that fishing was permitted. The decree that had sounded like a sentence became a concession, and not merely a formal permission, but a gesture charged with respect born not of hierarchical obligation, but of genuine recognition. That kind of recognition that emerges when people trained to obey rules encounter something that exceeds the rules, and, for an instant, remember that there was a world before the rules, and that this world still operates under laws that the rules attempt to replace but never entirely can. It was a silent victory, achieved without confrontation, but carrying far greater weight than any battle won, precisely because there was no loser, only two sides that had arrived at an understanding that served them both. The nets and the recognition. There are things that can only be understood after they happen, and there are those that can only be understood while they are happening, in real time, with no space between experience and comprehension. What Alexander understood upon seeing Helena before the Carthaginians belonged to the second category. The nets were cast into the river with the silent blessing of the Carthaginians. And in that casting, there was a quality of ritual that none of those present had planned, but that the moment had produced with that naturalness of things that occur when conditions are exactly right. The sound of the water embracing the linen cords mingled with the murmur of the sailors, who now worked with a lightness that was at once physical and something more, as though the tension that had been suffocating them had transformed not merely into relief, but into active gratitude, into that willingness for work that comes from recognizing that something which could have ended very badly had ended in a way that exceeded any reasonable expectation. The golden reflection of late afternoon lit the threads of the nets as though they were webs of light, and with each pull, more than food, it was destiny itself that seemed to emerge from the current with that quality of things that arrive when the right conditions converge. Alexander watched the scene with that particular pride that is not pride in oneself, but admiration for another. The kind of admiration that can only exist between people who know each other well enough for one to recognize in the other the manifestation of something that exceeds what either of them would be individually. The helm of his life was held not by his calloused hands alone, but also by Helena's gaze, which knew how to calm the waves where he saw only danger and which had demonstrated before the Carthaginians a form of power that no school of navigation taught and no military strategy treatise catalogued, yet whose result proved more effective than any alternative available in that moment. Helena, seated at the bow of one of the longboats, let the late afternoon light wash over her with that almost sacred serenity of people who have done what had to be done and who therefore have no need to examine whether they did it right. For many of the sailors watching her, there was something of revelation in that scene, not a spectacular revelation, but of the rarer and more lasting kind, one that shows something about the nature of things that was always there, yet needed a specific instant to become visible. The Carthaginians, in respectful silence, continued their own tasks, but no longer with hostility. Some cast glances of approval with that approval that needs no declaration to be felt, communicated through a quality of attention different from the watchful attention with which they had initially examined the strangers. One or two even made gestures of collaboration, passing along information about where the fish were most plentiful at that hour of the day, with that spontaneous generosity that emerges when the barrier between groups dissolves enough to reveal that their concrete interests had been compatible all along. That conflict had been a possibility, not an inevitability. When the nets came back full, the light of dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, as though the entire universe were celebrating that instant, not with trumpets, not with shouts of victory, only with the specific serenity of a triumph that had created no enemies, that had required no one to lose so that someone might win. The return to the deck. There are meals that feed the body, and there are those that feed memory, that become an internal reference for the rest of one's life. Scenes the mind revisits when it needs evidence that things can end well. The longboats returned slowly to the trireme, gliding over the river with that smoothness of vessels, carrying something that deserves to be transported with care. Not merely the physical weight of the full nets, but the different weight of the hours that had passed, hours that had produced an experience none of those present could fully narrate, because the most faithful account was the crew's own reverent silence as they rowed back. The Alethea awaited them, imposing and welcoming, with that quality of homes that do not judge what was done outside them, that simply open and receive. Upon stepping back onto the deck, the sailors could not contain their joy. They laughed loudly, exchanged words of relief, and between one gesture and the next, gave thanks not only to Alexander for his steady command, but above all to Helena, whose presence had transformed a decree into a concession with that efficiency no military strategy could have matched. As night drew near, Fires were lit, and the fresh fish was seasoned with herbs kept since Hispania. Those herbs that a woman from a Hispanian village had pointed out as essential for preserving flavor through long crossings. Herbs that carried within them the scent of that earlier encounter, linking this banquet to the one before, in a chain of hospitality that had begun before and would continue after. The aroma spread through the air like incense of victory, with that quality of scents that nourish not only the nose, but something deeper, some place where memory is stored not as information, but as sensation that can be accessed years later, and that, when accessed, brings back not merely the smell, but everything that was present in that moment. Alexander, seated beside Helena, raised his bowl like one toasting destiny, not with grand words, but with that silence more eloquent than any speech because it requires no mediation of language and communicates directly. Helena smiled with that quiet smile of one who understands that some victories need not be declared aloud because they are carved into the soul of all who witness them, and that these are the victories that last. Night fell like a protective mantle over the trireme. The stars spread across the sky like seeds of light cast by hands that were not human. The crew rested, sated and serene, while the river continued its eternal course with that particular indifference of rivers that have existed far longer than any civilization that ever developed along their banks, holding in their bed the memory of everything that had happened there without any human archive needing to record it, because the river's record is the river itself, which continues flowing in the same way regardless of any narrative ever made about it. For Alexander and Helena, that return to the deck meant more than rest. It was confirmation that the voyage was guided by forces greater than themselves, forces that revealed themselves not only in battles, but in the subtlety of encounters that transformed destiny into learning. The night and the lesson. There are conversations that can only be had after the danger has passed. When danger is still present, thoughts are tactical. When it has passed, they become philosophical. And it is in those moments that the most lasting truths are articulated. The night wrapped around the Alethea in a deep silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of water against the hull and the crackling of embers that still held the warmth of the banquet, with that persistence of embers that never fully surrender to the cold of night. Alexander walked the deck with steps that echoed as though conversing with the planks of the vessel. A conversation between the man and the instrument he had built with his own hands, that he had named revealed truth, that he had sailed through seas no map recorded with enough certainty to call them known. The wind carried to him the memory of the Carthaginians' stern eyes and their sudden transformation when Helena had presented herself as a presence that exceeded any category those guardians possessed for classifying what stood before them. Helena, seated at the bow, let the wind play with her hair, lit by the moon like threads of silver, and in her posture was that quality of people who are simultaneously present and absorbed, who are in the place where they are, while also being in an interior place that has no physical address, but is as real as the deck beneath their feet. She reflected on the silent power that had guided that encounter, not with the pride of one examining a conquest, but with that particular curiosity of one who has perceived something about herself that she had not perceived before, and that now needs to be understood not to be used, but to be honored. It had not been her intention to challenge men or laws, but simply to be present, whole, without the armor of impression management that most people wear as a second skin in situations of tension. And that simple wholeness had opened a passage where before there had been a wall, which revealed something about the nature of the walls men erect, that some are solid only to those who recognize them as solid. Alexander drew near and for a moment said nothing, simply stood beside her, feeling the breath of night and the gleam of stars reflecting on the surface of the river, with that particular patience of one who has learned that the most important moments often need silence to complete themselves before any word can approach them without diminishing them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. Today, I learned that the strength of hands does not always sustain destiny. Sometimes it is the gaze, the grace, the mystery that decides the course of the waters. Helena turned to him and smiled, not the smile of one receiving a compliment, but the smile of one who recognizes in another's words the confirmation of something both had understood simultaneously from different angles, arriving at the same point by paths that only converged there. Alexander remembered how he had learned from her the secret of fire that afternoon at Lysimachus's house, that it had not been force that taught him, but the delicacy of her hands guiding his over the flint stone. The river had merely repeated the lesson. The power that illuminates does not come from brutal collision, but from the quiet spark born when the right presence touches the right instant. The second day on the river. There is a difference between being in a place and inhabiting a place. The first is passing through. The second is presence. The second day on the African river was one of inhabiting. Dawn rose over the river like a curtain of liquid gold. The first light dancing on the calm surface with that quality of light that exists only in the first minutes after the sun decides to show itself, before the day has fully settled and the light acquires the more definitive and less magical quality of established morning. Alexander had decided they would remain anchored for another solar cycle, not out of hesitation about the road ahead, but out of recognition that the river still had things to offer beyond the fish the nets had gathered the evening before, and that wisdom sometimes means staying when urgency would say to leave. Under his orders, sailors descended into the longboats with clay jugs and empty goatskins. Fresh water, the most precious resource on long crossings, which the sea never offers and which African rivers offer in an abundance that feels like deliberate generosity. Others prepared for a second fishing with the focus of those who had learned the evening before that those waters were generous to anyone who approached them with respect. The smell of wet wood mingled with that of fresh clay from the banks in that combination, belonging to places where land and water find permanent balance. The perfume of a stable world, of a place that is not trying to be somewhere else, that simply is what it is with that completeness of things that require no external approval to exist fully. The Carthaginians on the opposite bank no longer maintained the hostile posture of the evening before. One or another nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a right that had been granted not by a revised decree, but by an understanding that had emerged from the previous day's encounter as a comprehension that needed no renewal because it had become, in that space between the two groups, something resembling a tacit agreement. At one point, one of them tossed a large fish into the river that floated toward a nearby Greek longboat, a gesture of acceptance that exceeded professional courtesy and entered the territory of something closer to friendship. That particular form of friendship that can exist between strangers who have never communicated adequately in any shared language, but who have recognized in each other something that the systems of classifying enemy and ally could not capture. Alexander noticed the sign and responded by raising his arm in a respectful salute, and in that gesture lay the mutual recognition that the time of distrust had passed, that the river had exercised its neutrality between different peoples in the most efficient way neutrality can be exercised, not as a formal declaration of impartiality, but as a space where potential enemies discover they have more in common than their differences suggest. In the afternoon, the river gleamed in shades of bronze beneath the declining sun. The barrels were full, the nets laden, and the crew exuded exhaustion and satisfaction. That particular combination that only work well done produces, which is neither the weariness of defeat nor the hollow euphoria of easy victory, but the satisfied weight of those who have used their capacities fully in service of something worth the effort. Alexander raised a metal cup of fresh water, symbol of life, the resource the sea never offers, and offered a silent toast to the crossing and to the woman who had changed the course of his journey. Helena returned his gaze with that understanding that needs no words, because words would be only an inadequate description of something both of them were experiencing directly. The smoking and the time of being. There is work that is only work, and there is work that is also meditation, that is ritual, that is a way of being completely present while the hands are occupied with a task the body knows so well that it does not need the mind to carry it out. Evening arrived, dressed in shades of copper and violet, with that particular generosity of African dusks that seem to have been conceived to demonstrate what light can do when it has the right angle and a cooperative atmosphere. The river took on the appearance of a liquid mirror, the reflection of the Alethea trembling softly on the water as though the vessel too were dreaming, as though the ship and its reflection were two aspects of the same thing that needed an intermediate surface to recognize each other. The nets hung heavy with the day's last catch, and the deck hummed with activity carrying that quality of coordinated collective work that is at once efficient and musical, each person doing their part without duplication, without gaps, the whole operating with a synchrony that only emerges when there is enough trust for each person to focus on their own task without watching to see whether others are doing theirs. Helena, wrapped in the humid breeze, moved among the fires, overseeing the preparation of food with that soft voice that gives instructions without the instructions sounding like orders. The difference between commanding and guiding being precisely that vocal quality that does not impose, but invites. She used dried herbs kept since Hispania, blending aromas that seemed to unite continents. The scent of Mediterranean herbs with the scent of fish from the African river, with the scent of wood that had sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. Three worlds converging over a fire that had been lit with a flint stone identical to the one that, on a distant afternoon at Lysimachus's house, had marked the beginning of everything. The smell of fish being smoked, of barley simmering and bay leaves crackling in the heat filled the air with that completeness of aromas that leave no room for the mind to wander, that hold attention in the present with an efficiency no deliberate meditation instruction could match. Alexander moved among the men with that presence of the captain who does not supervise but participates, helping to move barrels, secure sails, carry water, making himself part of the collective rhythm with that quality of leadership that does not rise above the work, but enters into it. The sailors saw him not as a distant captain who only gives orders, but as a brother in craft who shares the weight of the tasks that sustain the common journey. Their time with the river had taught them a lesson that no storm would have taught with the same clarity. Power does not lie in commanding, but in serving. And the discipline born of gratitude and mutual respect is more solid and more lasting than any discipline born of fear or of a hierarchy that imposes itself without justifying itself through example. When night fell, Alexander gathered everyone at the bank where the fires reflected on the river with that particular beauty of nocturnal reflections of fire on water, a double source of light, the real and the mirror, creating together more illumination than either would produce alone. He spoke to them of what they had learned in those 2 days on the African river, that the crossing is made not only of movement, but also of pause, that rest is as sacred as conquest, that the river had been more than a passage. It had been a teacher that teaches one to listen, to wait, to recognize when the time for action gives way to the time for being. The words echoed softly, dissolving into the night wind with that quality of the right words spoken at the right moment, which need not be repeated because they enter directly into the place where essential understandings take up residence. The offering and the calling. There are gestures that close a chapter, and there are those that, in closing it, are already opening the next, that are simultaneously conclusion and beginning, that belong to what has passed and to what is yet to come with equal legitimacy. Helena approached the bank and placed in the waters a small offering, a white shell, symbol of the childhood beaches that Tiphys had described with that precision of one who describes not what they imagined, but what they saw, and which Helena had sought first in the memory of her mother others' descriptions and now found gradually, beach by beach, bank by bank, as though each place where the Alethea docked were a syllable of a word that would only be fully understood once all the syllables had been gathered. The silent gesture was accompanied by the attentive gazes of everyone present, not out of superstition, but out of recognition that they had witnessed something in the past 2 days that deserved to be honored, and that Helena's gesture was the form that gratitude had found to express itself in a way that exceeded the verbal. The shell floated for an instant, and before sinking, reflected the moonlight with that quality of reflection that lasts less than a second, but is absolutely clear while it lasts, as though the sky itself responded to the gesture with approval, as though the forces governing those waters had received the offering and decided to confirm the receipt in the language they used to confirm such things. Reflected light, brief and unmistakable. A reverent murmur passed through the crew, that particular murmur of groups who have experienced something together and who simultaneously recognize that something as a shared experience. No one dared break the silence that settled afterward, because it was sacred silence of the kind that only exists when people sufficiently different from one another arrive at the same point of reverence, when the diversity of origins and beliefs and individual histories dissolves temporarily before something that all of them recognize as greater than any one of them. The night continued calm with that calmness that follows not the absence of challenges, but the successful resolution of challenges that had been genuine, the particular calmness of those who have passed through the trial and arrived at the other side not unscathed, but more complete. Some slept on the damp sands of the bank. Others kept watch, observing the stars that aligned as though tracing new paths across the firmament with that reading navigators make of the sky, not as astronomy, but as a conversation with forces that orient before any compass provides direction. Alexander, before retiring, cast one last gaze upon the river, knowing that at dawn they would sail again, that the African river had been a chapter, and that chapters end so that the ones that follow may begin, but wanting to carve that moment into memory with the precision that only deliberate attention produces. The light of the fires, the scent of smoked fish and barley, the silver reflection of the moon in Helena's hair, the sound of the river that would continue to exist after the Alethea departed, as it had existed before she arrived. Indifferent to human stories, yet holding in its eternal bed the memory that 2 worlds had met upon its banks for 2 days, and that this meeting had produced something that neither of those worlds would have produced alone. It was as though the entire universe breathed in harmony, preparing them for the calling that still echoed in the distance, that had echoed since before any of them were born to hear it, the calling of Thula. Discover in our next episode. The African river will be left behind, but what was learned on its banks will sail on with the Alethea, stored not in maps or nautical records, but in that other memory, more lasting and more faithful, that bodies and souls carry from the experiences that shaped them without ever needing to be taught to do so. The African coast will stretch to the south as the bow points north, and the route that Tiphys had described in childhood stories will begin to acquire possible coordinates, not on the charts of Massalia or Carthage, but in Helena's growing sense that she is moving in the right direction, that the way is becoming more real with each passing day. What is to come will carry the quality of what has been prepared by the Mediterranean storm, by the hospitality of Hispania, by the flint stone at Lysimachus's house, by the Carthaginian decree that Helena dissolved without raising her voice. Each episode was an initiation, and Thule, with its lights dancing in the sky of an island north of any map any cartographer of any age ever dared to draw, awaits precisely those who have come far enough to discover that it exists for those who had love and courage enough to seek it.